The surface area of a cone can be found by using the expression s pi r plus pi r squared, where s represents the slant height and r represents the radius of the base. Factor this expression. So you have to find the greatest common factor between these two. Well, they obviously have a pi in common, and they have an r in common. This has one r, that has two r's, so the most they have in common is an r. So now basically what you're doing is you're dividing each of these by pi r. So the pi's cross out, the r's cross out, leaves you with an s, plus the pi's cross out. That r on the bottom cancels one of the r's on the top, leaving you with an r. So now just to check it, pi r times s is pi rs, which is what I was supposed to get, and pi r times r is pi r squared. Number 17, you have to factor each polynomial by grouping. Check your answer. The key to grouping is you have to have 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. So the minute you see 4 terms, then you can say, okay, I'm going to group. So you can group the first two, you group the last two. Always make sure to group with a plus sign in the middle. Don't group it with a minus sign or you're going to mess up your signs. So then I say, what's my greatest common factor between w cubed and 4w squared? Well, between a 1 and a 4, it's a 1. And then they have w in common. That has 3 w's, that has 2 w's, so the most amount of w's is 2. Then you figure out what's missing. So w squared times what gives me w cubed? That's w. W squared times what gives me negative 4w squared? Well, 1 times negative 4 gives me the negative 4, and I've already got the w squared, so that's factored. Then my plus sign, then what's the greatest common factor between w and negative 4? Well, that's nothing in common, so then it's a 1. So then this is not factored because I have a plus sign outside of parentheses, so it's not a multiplication problem yet. But what I notice is the first multiplication problem is a w minus 4. The second multiplication problem has w minus 4. So what they have in common is w minus 4. So if I divide out that w minus 4, those would cross out and leaves me with w squared plus 1. So now if I want to make sure I'm right, I can do the box method and double check and make sure I get back to that problem. Or I can do w double distributive. So w times w squared is w cubed. W times 1, there's the 1w. Negative 4 times w squared, there's the negative 4w squared. And negative 4 times positive 1, there's your negative 4. So you can always take your answer, multiply it back out, and see if you get back to the problem. So tomorrow on your test, if you have time at the end of the hour, check your answers. Actually multiply them and see if you get back. So this one is a little tricky because I don't want to group with a minus sign in between my parentheses. So if I start grouping these, I'm going to have a minus sign right here. So I'm going to switch this one minus sign to plus the opposite. Then I'm going to group. So now I've grouped with a plus sign in between my two parentheses. My greatest common factor between 3x cubed and 6x squared, 3 is the smallest number, and 3 does go into 6, so it's 3. They have two x's in common, so that's x squared. So 3x squared times what gives me 3x cubed, b times x. 3 times 2 is 6, and I already have the x squared. Then over here, what's the greatest common factor between 4 and 8? Well, it's 4. I'm going to divide out a negative 4. So if I divide by a negative 4, negative 4 divided by negative 4 is positive 1x. Negative 8 divided by negative 4 is a positive 2. If I had divided by a positive 4, I would have had opposites in my parentheses. So I took care of that by dividing out a negative 4. So then this is not factored because there's a minus sign outside the parentheses. But I notice I have a common factor of x plus 2. So if I divide out the x plus 2, what am I left with? I'm left with 3x squared minus 4. Okay, number 19 also has 4 terms. So I group the first two, and I group the last two, and then I factor out my greatest common factor. So between 2p cubed and 6p squared, 2 is the smallest number, 2 goes into 6, so 2 is my greatest common factor. That has 3 p's, that has 2 p's, so they have 2 p's in common. So if I divide that out, 2p squared times what gives me 2p cubed? It's p. 2 times negative 3 gives me negative 6, and I've already got the p squared. Then I've got my plus sign. The greatest common factor between 15 and 5p I can divide out of 5. So if I actually divide by 5, 15 divided by 5 is 3. Negative 5 divided by 5 is negative p. Now that's not factored because I got this plus sign outside parentheses, but my parentheses don't exactly match anymore. That's a positive p, that's a negative p. That's a negative 3, that's a positive 3. So these are totally opposites. So to get rid of those opposites, I'm going to multiply 5 by negative 1, and I'm going to multiply these parentheses by negative 1. Because a negative 1 times a negative 1 is a positive 1. So I'm truly multiplying by a positive 1, which doesn't change anything. So when I do that, I know I'm going to get negative 5. When I do negative 3, or 3 times negative 1, I get negative 3. Negative 1 times negative p, I get positive p. Which still doesn't look like p minus 3, but I can switch the order of these two and say that's p minus 3. So what I get down to is 2p squared, p minus 3. 5 times negative 1 is negative 5. And then I can switch the order of these and write p minus 3. So basically, I switched the signs on everything after the plus sign, because two negatives negate each other. Now I have matching parentheses, so they have in common the p minus 3. If I divide out the p minus 3, I'm left with 2p squared minus 5. And of course, I can do the box method now and see if I get back to my original problem. Number 20 also has 4 terms, so I can group on this one. So I group the first two. I group the last two. My greatest common factor between n cubed and 6n squared is an n squared. So n squared times n gives me n cubed. N squared times negative 6 will give me negative 6n squared. My greatest common factor between 5n and 30 is a 5. So if I divide out of 5, 5 times n gives me 5n. 5 times negative 6 gives me 30. So then it's not factored because I have a plus sign outside the parentheses. But I notice I have a common factor of n minus 6. So I can pull out the n minus 6. If I pull that out, I'm left with n squared plus 5. And then if I did the box method on that, I would get back to my original problem.